The territory, which associates with agonizing death with the name Auschwitz, is the largest among those created by the Nazis of Germany. At first, political prisoners and prisoners of war were disposed of here, and from 1941, Jews, Roma people, and everyone who had a similar appearance. In the case of having such an appearance, a person was 100% doomed. Auschwitz became huge for logistical reasons. The Auschwitz camps had blocks where people were waiting for special tortures. For a modern person, it simply does not fit in the head of how all this was once possible. But look further. This is Explore History, and we'll continue this episode. Stay with us. Where was Auschwitz located and into which camps was divided? Upper Silesia is the southeastern part of the historical region of Silesia. There, in the era of the formation of the latter states, the borders of Bohemia, Poland, and the German principalities united into Prussia. During the years of the Third Reich, it again became a separate region, but now it is German, and after the war, the Germans lost control even over their unit. As a consequence, the area is divided by the Czech Republic and Poland. Geographically, the location coincides with the surroundings of the old Polish Oswiecim and again the Polish village of Brzezinka, Birkenau in the German manner. Here, a little north of a small mountain system, which was dubbed the Beskidi, a fragment of the Carpathians, a section of the mountain and foothill course of the Vistula River, ends. It makes a turn to the east by passing the described settlements first from the west and then from the north. As a result, the above-mentioned camps blocks occupied the entire territory between the old city with a fortress and a noisy village during their growth. That is why, in addition to the official German name of Auschwitz, in the documents drawn up by representatives of other countries, we also find the designations of all the presented points, both Auschwitz and Brzezinki. Let us remind you that only under the Reich the village was also called Birkenau. Today, Brzezinka and Monowitz, you'll learn about it later, are part of the city district of Auschwitz. Then we will have to return to the period of the existence of the Hitlerite state. Auschwitz I appeared before any other part, becoming the core of the city of death. This happened in May 1940, when Poland was already finally in the power of the Aryan Empire. The empire invaded the country, not even fearing that it would unleash World War II. During the occupation of this country and on the territory of the Czech Sudetenland, captured in 1938, ghettos were created for Jews and Roma people, and now there was a place to kill the people who had fallen into this trick. In 1941, 2 camps became Auschwitz, although the second was still under construction, and 2 years later there were 3 of them. A camp appeared at the Buna, that is, growing, the zone of extermination of people turned into an entire city of death. Its location was determined by the logistical routes of Hitler's punitive machine. In Silesia, roads from Polish, Czech, and German cities converged, and as for Upper Silesia, it was relatively close to Lviv, only 100 kilometers to the east. In all these corners of the continent, many Jews were found and taken to the extermination, spending relatively little time. If Auschwitz I was already working to the fullest, the Nazis adapted the existing barracks, then the remaining 2 parts of the complex were built by people driven from all over Europe. Moreover, in the role of handymen were just those who were later to live here, prisoners. The Germans were only architects, heads of logistics services, engineers and foremen. By the way, by 1942, when the most terrible wave of the Holocaust swept over, small areas for the disposal of people began to be administratively subordinate to Auschwitz. Literally, in each of the concentration camps of this city of death, there were blocks where something most horrible was happening, something that could not be seen in any other concentration camps. Auschwitz I. Until the year 1941, the institution was a prison for members of the Polish resistance. Before that, just one of the prisons of still independent Poland. And even earlier, the barracks of the Imperial Austrian troops. Southern Poland, according to one of the sections of the 18th century, went to the swollen state of the Habsburgs, also called Austria-Hungary. Himmler, the chief of the SS punitive structure, found a very acceptable point for the beginning of the total extermination of the Polish and Czech part of population, which were subhumans for the Reich. It is here that the entrance metal openwork arch, Labor Makes Free, is located. And there are also blocks number 10 and number 13. In one of them, incredibly narrow standing chambers with a tiny window for air were made to order. We will talk about them later. Auschwitz II, Birkenau. This is the largest camp inside the entire complex. The western edge of the blocks already reached the Vistula Valley, and in 1941 it was still under construction. The first echelon of Jews was accepted only in the beginning of 1942. It was here that the infamous block number 11 was located, where people were brutally tortured before execution. About how exactly you'll find out next. Look with special attention. Shocking details. And most importantly, it was Birkenau that kept gas chambers for the inhabitants of all Auschwitz facilities. The roads leading here were crowded with columns of those who had already been written off. Auschwitz III, Monowitz. It began its work 3 years later than the others, in 1943. It had the status of an auxiliary. The barracks were built on the edge of the city of death, which was already looking towards the village of Monowitz. This is again a German name, the Polish original of the toponym Monowitz. It was in this place that the prisoners built the factory where they later worked. It produced synthetic rubber. It went to German enterprises, and they produced goods and components for all spheres of the multifaceted industry of the greedy Third Reich. It was here that in order to operate the rubber plant, it was necessary to dig into the mines. The prisoners employed in them lived on average from 3 to 4 months. Then they came to disrepair. They were marched to nearby Auschwitz II, where the gas chambers operated. There, many of these workers were killed. The Eerie Details. Those who are superficially familiar with the topic of concentration camps think that gassing in rooms similar to showers is the worst possible thing that happened here. This is wrong. In such places, the torment of the poor souls of Auschwitz, on the contrary, ended. They were massively dying, and then they were burned after collecting their separately lying things and shoes, and from the corpses' gold and silver teeth, some cleverly hidden jewelry, as well as hair and even pieces of skin, if they had beautiful tattoos on them. And in this video chapter, you'll find out where the torment of prisoners began and afterwards continued, the most terrible, and not those that were related only to the conditions of work and detention itself. Thus, for those who have a weak heart, nervous system, and psyche, it is better to stop at this place of the video, and then look at a small conclusion at the very end of this episode. And now, those who decided to stay with us, keep watching the next chapter. Torture with claustrophobia and swelling of the limbs. Standing cells, like many other tortures of the Germans, were not invented by them. They existed before. Such cages, sometimes there was simply no way out, were invented by the jailers of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. The point is not to give the prisoner any opportunities other than the ability to stand without movements. It was in Auschwitz I, in the basement of Block 11, that such compartments had parameters of 24 by 22 centimeters. But the most terrible thing is the window for air and light. It was only 5 by 5 centimeters. A person had to stand facing it, so that a piece of food could be stuffed into his mouth, capable of saving his life just enough to continue the hellish torture of his body and psyche. As for the body, it was numb, especially the legs, which take on the total weight of entire body. And there was so little air that after a person had already managed to spoil it significantly, it became more difficult for him to breathe. And how to do it when the chest and back were literally imprinted into opposite brick partitions? There were only 22 centimeters between them. The only minimal space here was in the height. One of the prisoners, judging by his testimony in court, was kept here for 6 weeks, poorly supplied with food 3 times a day. Another victim explained that he ate his shoes from hunger. And yes, many people here began to dream of a bullet to end it all. At the Nuremberg tribunal, however, a defendant named Rudolf Höss claimed that he didn't allow his subordinates to cram prisoners into standing cells for longer than 3 nights. Like, they didn't cram anyone here for 6 weeks. The prisoners' witnesses lost their minds from exhaustion, so they saw the frenzy instead of real memories. But there's one important moment here. The witness was not one. As for the human psyche, things were also bad. Imagine that you're in a cell with a 5 by 5 centimeters window, in which the light enters only when it's turned on in the basement, and this happens only when a minimum of food is brought. It is not clear what time of day it is. Everything is numb and itchy, and then doesn't move altogether. Hunger, cold, and from the dried secretions themselves, burns appeared on the body of such punished. Panic for those who found themselves in such a cramped, locked space for the first time. And what if this person also had claustrophobia? Then panic caused such attacks that the person simply went crazy and suffocated. Let's also note that some cages were more spacious in depth. 4 people were driven there. Of course, it was possible to talk, but there was also a minus. The more they talk, the less clean air. Höss's successor ordered the removal of cells of this type at the height of 1943. The guards began to punish the prisoners guilty of certain violations more effectively, so that they would die faster. Boger swing. But not everyone who found themselves in the death block had to be killed. Some can only be punished or interrogated, as they say with partiality. The swing was named after its inventor, Wilhelm Boger, nicknamed the Devil. As soon as the NSDAP emerged, the young Aryan Wilhelm joined Hitlerjugend, where he became even more thoroughly imbued with racism. From that day on, thoughts began to slowly spin in his inventive head on how to make words Zionism, liberalism, and socialism much more painful, and more painful in the literal sense of the word. By the age of 25, there were already a lot of ideas, and so in 1931, that is 2 years before the Nazis finally came to power in Germany, during the assortment of assault battalions on socialists and Jews, he already began to implement all kinds of methods of interrogation, and the most effective of all, as the years have shown, was the swing. For infiltration, he was invited to the SS, especially since the troops were compromised by disloyalty to the Führer and mostly destroyed. The SS distributed its personnel, including to work in the death camps. They were under their full jurisdiction. Boger introduced his swing in Auschwitz as well, just when he was working there. What was this torture like? The structure consisted of 2 vertical poles, to which prisoners were hung upside down, tying their wrists to their ankles or to the bars. In this defenseless position, Boger interrogated them. At the same time, the victims were severely beaten with sticks and whips. Everyone who was interrogated with this method suffered unbearably. Most of them died immediately after that. Zyklon B Experiments. Before the introduction of full-fledged gas chambers, various gases were tried in separate blocks, in specially sealed barracks. The mentioned poisonous substance was first used in Block 11, near the infamous wall. An interesting feature was that the gas wasn't essentially inhaled. After doing the job, it was easily removed by weathering. The paradox of the whole situation associated with it lies in the fact that it was invented by a Jew, half German. The chemist's name was Fritz Haber. He made his discovery during the First World War. It was in this war, as you know, that they began to use chemical warfare agents for the first time. The recipient of the Nobel Prize, after all, gas was also a pesticide, was actually preparing weapons of the most massive, at that time, destruction for the German military machine. When the Nazis came to power, the scientists left for Britain as a precaution, and the Nazis continued to release combat gas, both for military and punitive purposes. But how exactly? Zyklon B was used without warning. The Jews did not know that they were being gathered in a block for this specific purpose. Here, they were more often simply distributed labor tasks. It was only later that the place was associated with death. The thing is that the original formula of cyclone, containing an eye irritant warning of danger, has been changed. Now the victims had no idea about anything until the very moment when they had nothing to breathe with. The gas was meanly displacing oxygen from the room. At the deadly stage of filling the space, the gas smelled like almonds. The world learned about this from those who were at the time working with it in the chambers. Often experiments on the combat scale of poisoning took place with the use of mustard gas. In August of 1941, a huge mass of Soviet prisoners of war of the second wave ended up in Birkenau. Some of them were poisoned in the block number 11, located here during experiments with gases. What happened behind the doors of block 10? Male and female prisoners became the test subjects for researchers, and not only doctors but also representatives of other sciences. The guards called those brought here rabbits. Most often, the reaction of the human body to various substances was studied. Some drugs were created for disinfection, while others were created for sterilization. The Nazis left people after any given experiment only for one purpose: as slaves. They were forbidden to breed, and here they checked the compatibility of blood groups by transfusing the owner of the blood of one group with the blood of another group. You can guess the consequences of such inhuman experiments. It is now known to doctors that in extreme cases, carriers of a certain group are suitable for the one that precedes it in number. Therefore, there are most problems with blood for carriers of the first group. But then the world didn't know about this yet, and hundreds of test subjects died on the couches next to the transfusion machines. What kind of torment did those who were taken to the designated block have to endure? Firstly, substances that had not been tested on anyone before killed not only the secretions and organs of the reproductive system, but also other vital parts of body. The prisoners had pain and ailments. Some resulted in death after a series of convulsions caused by acute painful sensations. But people were also made incisions without anesthesia. in the chest as well as abdominal region. Speaking of Jewish women, they also got to the reproductive system. Men were sometimes simply cut off either part of the genitals or all of them. Often the reproductive system was sterilized with huge doses of X-rays. There were huge burns. In particular, scientists such as Mengele, Schumann, Weber, Bloch, and Clauberg were frequent visitors to this spacious room. In addition to the issues of sterilization, disinfection, and transfusion, they were interested in finding a way out of the problem of classifying human skulls. Among the scientists were not only doctors, but also rodents of granite of other sciences. Anthropologists, craniologists, specialists in skulls often ordered the murder of people with the most significant signs of one or another anthropological type. Such specialists made a collection of heads for research. And one of the presented naturalists, a military chemist, had to desperately study the varieties and stages of mustard gas poisoning in people with a particular type of organism. Mustard gas, also known from the First World War, as it turned out, also has a number of properties that have not been previously identified by scientists. It kills people of different human races in different ways. Some last much longer. Mustard gas poisoned not only through the lungs, but also affected all mucous membranes, creating painful abscesses on the skin. It was invented independently by British and Frenchmen. Psychological harassment. The inhabitants of Auschwitz never knew when they would die. The staff of the local camps amused themselves by masterfully inventing more and more reasons for the moral justification, in the eyes of the unfortunate men, of his execution. But the Germans themselves knew that there was no reason, just the prisoner would be neutralized after some time. Die at work, from hunger, disease, experiment, beating for impudence, shooting for violating the regime, or go to the gas chamber for reasons of exhaustion of the body. The guards and sometimes SS officers who came here for various reasons just wanted to entertain themselves with something other than drinking schnapps, smoking cigars, and listening to Nazi marches from a gramophone. Between two of the three death blocks at different points of the wall, any of the poor fellows could encounter such bored, cruel Nazis. They immediately dragged him into the interrogation room to investigate his crime, violating the regime, participating in the local resistance movement, stealing, or disrespecting the Nazi. In fact, for the sake of fun, the turntables, coordinating officers and guards who descended from the wall, also invented many other sins that were ridiculous in their essence. They interrogated the prisoner either cruelly or gently, honing their skills of investigation. They played a game called bad and good cop or arranged face-to-face confrontations, grabbing a whole group at the wall. Investigative actions sometimes lasted several hours. The punishers managed to eat several times, go to the restroom, or perform one or another of their duties. There were many questions, and the mental powers of the victims, without water, food, sufficient sleep, and rest, began to fail them. Even more than that, there was also psychological exhaustion. People were yelled at, beaten, pressed with their faces against the wall or table, put a gun to the temple or back of the head. As a result, the victims got entangled in the testimony and inadvertently said something that the Nazis could take as a confession. After that, an improvised court sentence was read to them, and they received the same bullet, the one that many of them have been waiting for a long time, especially when truly attentive prisoners could not incriminate themselves for several days. And sometimes the murderers, however, had reasons for inquiry. They were concerned about the resistance. When hundreds of thousands of prisoners were already accumulating in Auschwitz, it really suddenly appeared here. At that time, real detectives were involved in the case. Do not forget that Auschwitz I was originally a prison for political criminals, that is, for real Polish members of the resistance. Humiliation. Not only Jews were subjected to a kind of humiliation, but also Slavs, members of the Polish resistance, Soviet and Polish prisoners of war who were taken prisoner from 1940 to August 1941. At the wall, they were shot with a pistol, but at first they could stand for hours in a long line, naked, with their hands tied behind their backs. As for the military, some of them, as it was said, were poisoned by Zyklon B. They were its first victims. In total, 850 people were killed in Auschwitz by gas alone, Soviet citizens and Poles, and at least 150 people were shot, naked, and beaten. Yes, before that, prisoners of war were also beaten, and members of the Polish resistance were generally tortured, so that they indicated where their comrades in arms lived, who were still numerous. The local punishers used the experience of the Gestapo, military and colonial police of the Third Reich. They were placed between electric stoves that were closely pushed together. They hung prisoner with his hands tied to his legs and then beat him with chains from different sides. They twisted their arms and secured this composition with a thick chain. They put needles under their nails and then pulled them out all together. Gestapo engineers invented a machine for this. There were also devices for cutting and slicing, causing damage to the body of varying severity. And this is in addition to the fact that in anticipation of the torture itself, people had their hands shackled above their heads, securely attaching the shackles to the wall. People were not flogged with a whip, but namely chains. Women overseers. Of these various territories, only one had the most terrible death blocks, Hindenburg. The rest were exclusively labor zones, but they were exploited in such a way that people could fall to the ground lifeless, and they were simply finished off by guards or turntables from the towers. Specifically in Hindenburg, from 1942, Nazi punishers tortured Jewish women in the amount of 400 to 500 people, and the guards here were women. The place appeared on the outskirts of the Polish village of Zabrze, located far away on the west bank of the Vistula, being situated at the highway leading from Polish Lodz to Czech Ostrava. That is, Hindenburg was separated from the concentration camp city of Auschwitz itself by at least 58 kilometers of road. As in the Ravensbrück women's camp, Hindenburg women, including pregnant women, were provided to Nazi medical scientists. They ended up in the medical laboratories and infirmaries located nearby. They experimented on vaccines. Before that, they made wounds and infected these women. Awful malice. However, the topic of medical experiments is separate. After all, it is not connected with death blocks, but with infirmaries laboratories, where prisoners were taken from the barracks. The only exception was Block 10. And if only that, already on the parade ground or in the barracks themselves, the guards could get to the bottom of any Jewish woman for any reason. Too bold of a look, she got up from the floor for a long time after a kick, said or did nothing when she had to, or just too beautiful. Dogs could be lowered to such a place or beaten with hands, feet, and even sticks to a half-dead state. Later, such women died, though they could have died exactly on the spot. The guards always had pistols with them if something unexpected happens. At the present moment, in Poland, there is a museum included in the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List. Created back in 1947, it tells the story of all the Auschwitz camps, including the fate of the most famous surviving prisoners, as well as the most famous executioners of this terrific place. That was Explore History. Leave a like and subscribe. Let history not be forgotten. We see you in upcoming episodes.